readers, it's cozy mystery author Meg Muldoon here, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Meg's Cozy Happy Hour. And thanks so much for being here today with me. This episode is really exciting because we are finally wrapping up Warren and the Sparks Lake mystery. So we only have a few more chapters left in that mystery, that no Christmas River novella. So it's pretty exciting here. And if you remember last week, we kind of left off on kind of a harrowing chapter where we finally found out who shot Clyde Driggs. So this is kind of the wrap up here. So I guess without further ado, I'll start reading. So here we go. Chapter 17. Warren sat on the picnic table and watched the Sheriff Sullivan Coe pushed Pete Driggs into the back of his deputy car. It had been a short chase. In Pete's desperate flight through the woods, he'd tripped over a fallen log and broken his ankle. The deputies who had arrived had been able to corner him relatively easily. He was wailing with pain as they walked him to the car. Shortly after they dealt with Pete, Warren watched another one of Sheriff Coe's deputies guide Ada Driggs by handcuffs into the same car. She continued to scream about how she didn't know what was going on and how she had nothing to do with any of it, that Pete had acted alone. Of course, everyone knew this wasn't true. Clyde Driggs, most of all. Warren looked over at Mr. Driggs now. The big man was sitting hunched over on the bench beside him. The general store owner was green in the face and looked like he was still in a great deal of pain, but he was sitting upright, and his recovery seemed to be nothing short of miraculous. "How do you know, Mr. Driggs?" Warren asked. "How do you know it was Pete all along?" Mr. Driggs took his time in answering. "Right before I was hit, I heard the squeaking of his shoes," Mr. Driggs said. "Pete always wears that squeaky pair. They're too small for his big feet, but he bought them because he liked the way they looked. Pete's always been vain like that." He sighed and looked sad suddenly, like the weight of the world had just rolled on his shoulders. "I'd been suspecting that something was going on between Pete and Ada for some time now," Mr. Driggs mumbled, "but I never would have believed they'd go so far as this." The big man fell silent. Sheriff Sullivan Coe began walking toward them, and Warren felt his muscles tense. "I'm glad you told the sheriff when you did, Mr. Driggs," Warren said. "Glad he listened to you, too." "So am I," Mr. Driggs said. "You're a good kid, Warren. I'd have hated to see you get hurt in this ugly business." The sheriff stopped just short of the picnic table, looking serious. "Mr. Driggs, if you would come with us, we'd like to take your statement at the station." Sullivan Coe's eyes flashed at Warren. He cleared his throat and had trouble holding Warren's stare. We'd appreciate it if you would come along too, Mr. Peters." Warren looked past Sullivan Coe. He didn't much care for liars. But eventually, Warren helped Mr. Driggs to his car, then drove them to the sheriff's station downtown. Chapter 18. The next Friday, Warren arrived at Mr. Stanley's English class and saw something that made his heart nearly leap out of his rib cage. The seat, her seat, which had been empty now for so long, was no longer vacant. He paused for a moment in the doorway of the classroom, feeling himself overcome with happiness. Then he did something he'd never done before. Warren went over and sat down right next to May Reed. "You're back," he said. "You're really back." The words came out naturally, and he didn't have to force them. She looked at him, those eyes of hers lighting up a fire somewhere deep in his soul. "Mr. Stanley said if I can catch up on all the reading I missed in my spare time, then it won't affect my grade." Warren beamed. "I saw Leroy at the general store yesterday," he said. "He seems like he's doing okay." With the right man arrested, Leroy had been released. Clyde Driggs had offered Leroy his old job back and had given him a raise as an apology for firing him in the first place. May nodded. "My brother's doing just fine now," she said, "thanks to you." "Ah, I didn't do much," he mumbled bashfully. "You helped us, which is more than anybody else did, Warren." Warren's cheeks grew hot when she said his name like that. He cleared his throat, trying to come up with something to say, but words eluded him. "You know, your mother stopped by our house last week," May said. "Right before they found out that Pete was the one who shot Mr. Driggs." Warren raised his eyebrows. "My mother? What? I mean, why would she—" "I don't know," May said, "but she spoke to my father for a long time in private. I don't know what it was about." May smiled slightly. "Your mom sure seems nice. She brought over the most delicious bread I've ever tasted." Just then, Mr. Stanley cleared his throat, getting the students' attention before launching into another boring lecture. lecture. May leaned a little closer to Warren, lowering her voice, her beautiful brown eyes fixed on him. I hope we find the right time to talk one of these days, Warren, because I wanted to tell you, I think you're really nice, maybe nicer than anybody I've ever met before. Warren felt so lightheaded and happy he thought he might just up and float away. Chapter 19. It was Mother's Day, and it was shaping up to be the best one that Warren could remember. He'd awoken early that morning and had gone fishing, returning home with 3 fat trout and a bundle of fresh wildflowers from a nearby meadow. Then he'd spent the afternoon in the kitchen, puttering around with pots and pans and ingredients he wasn't familiar with. He'd made a real mess of things, and how dinner was going to turn out, he really couldn't say. But his mother had seemed downright pleased by her son's efforts, and didn't seem to be at all concerned about the final product. His father, too, had seemed pleased. Martin Peters' mood had taken a lighter turn in recent days. Warren didn't know for sure, but he had a feeling it might have been on account of the exam he'd brought home from his English class earlier that week. Warren had gotten an A thanks to the study sessions with May, and when he presented his father with the test, the old man actually smiled and rubbed Warren's head in the proud kind of way that he hadn't done in a long, long time. Warren still wasn't ever going to be a lawyer or a politician, but it seemed that his father had let up on all of that lately, ever since that day at the lake when Pete pointed that rifle at him. His father no longer hassled him about academics and his future, and seemed to be content just to spend quality time with his son. The cheese braid bread was in the oven, and the trout were browning in a frying pan of butter when Warren tried to finally explain to his mother about the lie he'd told the sheriff when he'd come to question him about Clyde's shooting. But when he brought it up, she just shook her head. You don't have to say anything about it, Wren. I always trust you to do the right thing. I know you'll do right because it's the way your father and I raised you. She squeezed his shoulder then and smiled. Later, when the cheese braid was nearly done and the trout were a golden brown, Warren started looking for the silver platter, the one his mother used to serve the Sunday meal. But when he asked her where it was, she rifled around in the cupboard for a while, finding an old chipped porcelain platter instead. Here, Wren, use this one. Warren looked at her, confused. But it's Mother's Day, he said. Don't you think that the silver one would be better? His mother smiled. This will do just fine for me, Wren. Just fine. It took him a long while to realize what had become of the silver platter. But when he figured it out, he stared at her in disbelief. You didn't have to do that, Ma, he said. I know how much that platter meant to you. It was worth a lot. You didn't have to give it to the Reed family. You're right, Wren. That platter was a nice thing, she said. But things are just things. People, our neighbors, friends, and family. That's what really matters in life. Everything else is just window dressing. And if you're in a position to help others, then you ought to. That's what I believe anyway. The oven timer dinged just then. Etta went over and looked inside. The bread wasn't quite as billowy as when his mother made it, and instead of a nice tight braid, it came out as more of a blob. Still, it was golden brown and looked decent enough. I'd say the bread's about done, Wren. Couldn't have made it better myself. Oh, pish-posh, Ma, he said with a mischievous smile. Pish-posh. Warren's mother didn't stop laughing until long after the sun had gone down. Chapter 20. Present Day. Warren stood at the edge of Sparks Lake, watching the sun dance on the ripples of the water. A gentle breeze blew into his old wrinkled face. He felt the beautiful spring sun beating down on his back, warming his old muscles. He knelt down, placing the 2 bouquets of wildflowers into the water, lapping against the sandy shore. He pushed them out, watching for a long time as the flowers came loose of their bouquets, the individual blossoms spreading out across the lake. Warren thought about his mother now, the lessons she taught him all those years ago, lessons that he still lived by to this day, the kindness she'd showed him, the goodness she showed to everyone. He thought of May too then, about the way those deep, beautiful brown eyes looked that day at the lake, the way they sparkled the day of their wedding a few years later, about how lucky he'd been for the time they'd had together, even if it wasn't as long as he'd hoped for. When Warren closed his eyes, he could still see them both here at the lake, his daughter too now. Warren had seen his fair share of tragedy in his long life. Still, when he came to Sparks Lake every Mother's Day, he didn't feel so much sorrow anymore as he did gladness. In his old age, he could see the truth of that old adage, It was better to have loved than to have never loved at all. Damn straight, he thought. Damn straight. Warren heard the sound of car tires at the trailhead parking lot a little ways back. A few moments later, he heard the sound of footsteps. Sorry I'm late, old man. You should have seen the line at the pie shop this morning. We ran out of cherry pie by 10 a.m., and I swear, I thought the customers were going to eat me alive. Warren felt his heart swell at the sound of the familiar voice. He turned around to see his granddaughter standing there, carrying 2 fishing poles and a tackle box. No matter, Cinny B, he said. I'm just glad you're here. Warren put an arm around his granddaughter, hugging her. Did you bring the night crawlers like I asked, he said. Sure did. I got a whole bag of them. What about extra line? You bring some of that? His granddaughter nodded. And what about a pie? Did you bring a pie? Cinnamon rolled her beautiful brown eyes at him. Pish posh, old man. Of course I did. You're acting like I've never been fishing with you before. Warren couldn't help but smile to himself. The end. So there you go. That's the end of Warren and the Sparks Lake Mystery. And I really hope that you guys enjoyed it and enjoyed this whole month-long reading of it. And I know I did. I had a great time. And this is one of my favorite stories from Christmas River. And I just love spending that time with Warren in the past. And I also just love just the nostalgia of the whole story and just getting a chance to kind of see Christmas River at a different time period, and also the way the story wraps up at the end. I just love Edda so much, and I love Cinnamon there at the end. And anyway, I hope you guys had a really nice time listening to the story, and I'll be back next week for another cozy happy hour. But thanks so much for joining me here today, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, and have a great time and stay safe, and I'll see you next week. So